Hello and welcome to this episode of Reading Uncomfortably. This is our first review of a book and I am hoping that you're going to really like it. I'm going to try my best not to have to take about 1,000 versions of this video as I did with the first one because I think I will probably come across more robotic the more polished it is. And who are we as human beings if not incredibly unpolished? So with that, I will get started on talking about our first book, The Dumb House by John Burnside. It is absolutely horrific in the best way. I was a bit uncertain about whether or not to have this as our first book to read because I was very much aware that it is a really deeply disturbing book, and I thought, gosh, if I make this the first book that we review or the first book that I recommend reading, perhaps this is just going to be the thing that tips everybody over the edge and no one will ever read anything I recommend ever again. So I was a bit hesitant, but the whole point of me doing this channel, or at least one of the reasons I wanted to do it, was because I was reading things like this, although maybe not on this scale, and I felt like I needed to talk to someone about them, I needed to share them, and so this one has really deeply unsettled me, and I figured that it would be a good place for me to talk about it, and hopefully you will I don't feel like enjoy is the right word. Hopefully you will get as much out of it as it wants you to. I hope it affects you. So yeah, so that's our book for this week. So I'll start by sort of giving you a synopsis of the book from the back. As a child, Luke's mother often tells him the story of the Dumb House, an experiment on newborn babies raised in silence, designed to test the innateness of language. As Luke grows up, his interest in language and the delicate balance of life and death leads to amateur dissections of small animals, tiny hearts revealed still pumping as life trickles away. Yes, you heard that right. But as an adult, following the death of his mother, Luke's obsession deepens, resulting in a haunting and bizarre experiment on Luke's own children. And so when I read this blurb when I was standing in a bookstore and thinking of whether or not I'd like to read it, I thought that sounds like a really unsettling but slightly interesting text, and we'll, pick it up and we'll see how it goes. I don't really think I had fully prepared myself for what I was about to be submerged into reading this text. So let's think a bit about this. So I really liked this book in the way that it made me feel sick. So I hope that if you're watching this video and you're interested in this channel, then this is probably one of the top peak stories I've ever read that have been really deeply unsettling. So let's start there, right? So it is a really horribly uncomfortable book. So Luke's obsession kind of centres on this story that he's heard of a Persian myth where there was once a palace filled with newborn children who were attended only by mutes, and so the children in this palace never had heard anybody speak or communicate using language before. And so he becomes obsessed with this idea, and this sort of idea whether language and communication is innate or acquired, and what this does for our experience of the world, our experience of other human beings in relation to just this notion of communication. What happens if language is not given to a child? And he becomes really obsessed with this notion. This is kind of what propels him forward in his quest. And it's, I think this is, the Dumb House, this is what the place was called where the children were kept. And really Luke is just absolutely obsessed with this idea, and it kind of trickles into his experiments on animals, as we sort of hear. Yes, he does dissect live animals, and you are sort of, through first person narration, you are subject to also experiencing that. I'm a vegetarian, so really upsets me hearing about this. But this is kind of, the character himself, he's just, he's fascinated by this idea of language, and more importantly, how this connects to notions of human being. And he relates this to the notion of the soul. So That's kind of where we are. As an introduction, it's split into 3 parts. We get Karen, Lillian and the twins, and those 3 characters are really the sort of, other than Luke, these are the characters around which the sort of the development of the narrative orbits, and all play a very significant role in the text itself, so you will kind of get to understand them. I kind of like, I'm giving this out in such cautionary sort of tale. I'm a bit like, read it, but also, you know, if this was about trigger warnings, I'd be like, yeah, trigger warning, because this is heavy. The narrative is non-linear, so we get this sort of propelling forward in the narrative, but we're sort of taken back. The whole thing's rather reflective, so we kind of get an introduction that's present tense, and then we get flashbacks to him as a child. Reveals quite a lot, but it doesn't, also what I quite liked about this book is it doesn't overladen the whole idea of Luke being this really hideous character. It's not overladen with sort of like woe is me stories of sympathy of him being a child. Like, we don't get that. We get a couple of flashes, and I mean it like if you blink you miss it kind of thing when you're reading it. We get a couple of flashes of sort of experiences he's had that have been deeply unpleasant as a child, but that's not what this is about, right? So this is not a sympathetic story, or maybe it is, maybe you'll read it differently to what I did, but I don't feel sympathy for Luke in this story, but you do get those moments of sort of, okay, there is more to him than, I suppose, what might come across as sort of straight psychopathic tendencies. We might be seeing more of a sociopath, so someone who's sort of conditioned to have those traits of sociopathy. It's not your average kind of serial killer kidnapper story. I wanted to kind of highlight potential similar texts that might be of interest. So this book I read a review by somebody else who didn't like it, so I kind of suppose maybe this is not for everybody. Maybe I just really enjoyed it because it's doing, I think it's doing some really interesting things with the notion of language, which I'll come on to. But someone didn't like it. They said that it was kind of too, well, they said too intellectual, but I don't really like the idea of that as a notion. I think you'll either gel with it or you won't. I'm interested in what it's doing about its commentary on language and what that does for human relations or human development. So I find that interesting, but okay, I will take that person's review on board. This is another kind of sort of kidnappy, live in the basement type book, but it's someone self-selects to be part of the Warlow experiment. I mean, what a beautiful cover that is. That is probably one of the reasons I picked it up. And this is kind of doing that, but it's not doing it, I don't think, in what this person has considered, you know, a more intellectual or academic kind of approach to it. I think it is doing a similar thing around language though. So the person who self-selects themselves to be part of the Warlow experiment, the idea is that this person was entirely literate and able to read and write. Turns out the person is not, and that is potentially one of the reasons why the experiment, other than a multitude of other reasons, but one of the reasons why the experiment is kind of flawed, deeply flawed from the start. Anyway, that's another potential one that you might be interested in. And the other one is kind of another kidnapper collector in the basement. I swear I don't only read these books. That's just a bit of a theme. Subconsciously, I actually stacked the Warlow experiment and the collector in the same space on my bookshelf, and I was a bit like, oh, that's strange that I did that without even realising. So the collector, I think I'd like to discuss this potentially in another video, not too stacked close to this one, so that we don't just get the impression that what I read is kidnapper stories. But this is kind of this is similar, but without that sort of without discussing ideas of what I will come to discuss later, sort of post-structural ideas of language. This is kind of just this is your average serial killer kidnapper kind of style story. Very good though, very good book. So I will come back to this one. I won't review the Warlow experiment, I don't think, because it didn't really quite do it for me, but that doesn't mean that you won't enjoy it. And so it's a dark and twisted perception of the world. We're seeing this entirely through his eyes. And so everything that he does, every hideous act, every bit of cruelty, it's all through him. And he is really deeply disturbed, and we're unfortunately forced to kind of see the world through his eyes. And in so doing, we are subjected to a view of the world which is without remorse, which is without empathy, which is sort of, you know, really deeply unsettling, a moral narrator that we kind of have to navigate his story through. And so we don't have, we're not spending time in this book feeling sorry for the things that we've done. I say we because, you know, we are the I in this text. And so, yeah, so this kind of positioned us in a really hideous way, seeing it through his perspective. Whereas in The Collector, I don't really want to do this too much, but in The Collector, we get a bit of both perspectives. So maybe that's something that interests you. So our protagonist, Luke, his heinous acts are really without remorse, and I'm going to give you a little snippet of that. And it's just the way that he thinks about things, right? So the idea of sort of language in this is throughout the text. It's threaded throughout the text, and one of the things he talks about is the twins are his biologically he's fathered these children, his biological twins, but he has no sort of sense of paternalism towards them. And the way that he avoids doing that is he doesn't give them names. He doesn't sort of take ownership of them as a father figure. And he sees sort of the idea of language being conditioning you to want to feel a particular way. And what he does is kind of remove that possibility through not giving them names, and not perceiving himself as father or, you know, as dad or whatever you might say. Okay, so here's a wee little snippet of it. I knew from the first that it was an error to think of the twins as my children, whatever the biological reality. It is only a flaw in the language that confuses kinship with possession, and in this case, the kinship was accidental. I had no real connection with these creatures who lay in the basement room, crying and fouling themselves, clinging to a life that I could easily have ended with a basin of water or a length of twine. So this guy, yeah, so he he sort of removes the linguistic association of the children as being his, and this idea of possession. And in so doing, he kind of sees them basically as creatures, as what he describes them as, fouling and, you know, crying and fouling. So that's what babies do. But the way he's sort of describing that is you know, one that's really dehumanizes the twins, right? These are babies. And he says clinging to a life as well, in the way the language there is used, kind of, it's this idea that it's almost like an unwanted clinging, you know. It's clinging is a word that's used to describe something that you don't want hanging on to you, you know, it's clinging to me. And just the fact he sort of says, I could easily end it with a basin of water, i.e. drown them, or a length of twine around the neck kind of thing. You're just like, these are literal babies we're talking about. What the, you know, what are you doing? So this guy, he's not a nice guy. Greatest understatement ever. But he has this fervent belief that what he's doing is the right thing to do. He thinks he's doing really rigorous research, all in the name of discovering the soul. And this is what he links to language. So he genuinely believes, he, you know, talks about the experiment, he talks about the conditions of the experiment as being, you know, being rigorous. They need to be entirely correct so that you make sure that it's an experiment that could be reliable, valid, replicable, etc. But nowhere in this sort of idea of research for him is the notion of ethics, which is obviously a huge part of any kind of research that's undertaken. In my place of work, I sit on research ethics committees, and there is no way this would get past a research ethics committee. So, you know, this is a hugely, this is an understatement, but a hugely unethical research project that he undertakes, but really sees himself as contributing seriously to science. He sees himself as a serious scientist in undertaking this experiment, and that really can't be, you know, we can't stress enough how much that shapes his engagement with the world. So in this text, I think the writing is absolutely executed to such a high standard. I think if this was just a gross, grim, really disheartening, unsettling read, maybe I'd be less interested in it. But the language, the way it's written is phenomenal. Really, to the point where actually I'm going to read another one of Burnside's books, because I was like, this is actually just exquisitely written, as the Sunday Times have commented on the back. Burnside's prose is exquisite as he dissects his themes with delicacy to produce a novel resonant with poetic menace. I just think that's lovely, poetic menace. So, you know, the language is really good in this. That is one of the reasons why I like it, not just because it made me feel gross. But, you know, I think if we sort of move beyond the sort of key disgusting parts about this text as being, you know, our swathes of disbelief in Luke's ardent determination to complete his experiment and do some really heinous things. Trust me, there are enough in here that you can't forget them. It is actually doing some really interesting things with the language. So let me take you into some of that, if I may indulge myself. So that's kind of hopefully be interesting to you as well. So psychoanalytically speaking, well, there's some really interesting stuff it's doing with the Oedipal complex. Luke's obsession with his mother can't be ignored in this. It's sort of a really disturbing kind of relationship he has with his mum and his obsession with her and her obsession and treatment of him. It's like, it's really hard to put your finger on the relationship they have as well, because it's not as though she dotes on him, but he certainly dotes on her. He just kind of fits into her world, and you know, there is no, I think it's because we see it through his eyes, and he is obviously suffering with sociopathy or psychopathy, so he is not he's not able to feel those emotions that one would and should feel. So maybe that's why the mum doesn't come across as being particularly loving, but you know, that's kind of my views on her. So there's that to explore, but really for me this book, and I think Burnside is more than aware of this being kind of the real fact of this book, is this idea of post-structuralism kind of coming through, which as a theory, if you're not familiar with, identifies as a literary critical technique and a way of theorising that belongs to literary criticism. But it's sort of a critical theory that looks into and explores notions sort of you know, emancipatory social sciences and discourse analysis, and looking at ideologies and critiquing ideologies and the way that the world is shaped through ideologies, and the way we understand ourselves is shaped through ideologies. And what post-structuralism tries to do is sort of highlight those and unpick those and show where the gaps are, show where the threads can be pulled to unravel a lot of that. So that's kind of this. But also alongside that, as a philosophy, it's one that is interested in how thought works, how we organise ourselves, society, but also how we're thinking about things. The way that we understand the world is through language, and how much language plays into the way that we therefore perceive the world. And this shapes our perception of the world. Language is you know, so important. And language infiltrates our identities, perceptions of ourselves, of others, and the world around us. And this is why, you know, when people argue that what does it matter that you're, you know, what does it matter what you call somebody or how you refer to somebody, or, you know, the descriptions of people, it's like it literally means everything. It is so important. So, you know, when you see those kind of tops that are for girls and tops for boys, and the boys' tops are all sort of wild and adventurer and little chaos machine kind of thing, and the girls are all sort of like beauty queen and princess, and these are all like, this to me is just one of the most hideous assaults on the way that gender or people's perceptions of gender develop, therefore, that women and girls, you know, in their clothing are told beauty is kind of the only thing that's of real importance to them. And for boys, you know, you can be an adventurer, you can go out, you can achieve, you can be determined, you can also be chaotic if you want to and not control your emotions. And this has huge reaching consequences. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. So language, very important. Language is a key aspect of post-structuralism. And so what this text is doing is engaging with some of those ideas of language. So what we see in this text is a character who is trying to undo the very language that shapes our perception of the world. And he does that by taking away language from the twins. He removes language entirely by not allowing them to communicate with anyone. He is the sole person who sees them, and he does not communicate with them anyway. You know, he feeds and clothes and washes them, but otherwise, you know, it's very much limited, the contact time he has with them. And for him, this is an experiment to understand what gives human beings a soul. He sees this as being an experiment to see if we took away language, do we take away human nature? Do we take away what it means to be a human being and how human beings function? How if we can't function, you know, what do we become? And this is kind of the experiment. And this is what interests him. So the dissections of animals at the start are a start to try and pinpoint the soul. You know, he's like opening up animals in order to try and locate where the soul might house. And this is kind of grotesquely evolved into human subjects, where he sort of starts to see how language kind of influences the way human beings communicate and therefore understand ourselves, etc. But this is why this text really interested me, is that kind of association of language and what that does, and the way that communication is developed. And yeah, so I think I'll wrap up here, because I also don't want to go into too much detail of the book, because I don't want to spoil any of those moments that will unsettle you. And so it is a deeply deplorable character that we're forced into witnessing some acts belonging to, and I kind of say proceed with caution. I know this is my first video, so maybe you'll proceed anyway, but it is really unsettling. It is really reading uncomfortably, I have to admit, but it's so good, I think, and hopefully if you dare read it, hopefully you'll enjoy those moments of just really great writing, great prose, emotionless but exquisitely written text. So thank you for watching this video if you've made it to the end. I appreciate that. And hopefully I've inspired you to want to read this text, or if not, any of the other two that I've mentioned. If this sounds a bit heavy and a bit gross, then maybe the other two, which are less heavy and less gross, will be of interest to you. I hope you continue to read uncomfortably, and I hope that you'll tune into a following video of our next book, which is Yukio Mishima's Life for Sale, a brilliant book, not a disgusting character who makes you feel deeply unsettled in this kind of way, but one that is kind of absurdly humorous, but also touching on some really interesting and sort of uncomfortable notions of freedom and morality, but in a totally different kind of way to this one. So another uncomfortable read, but uncomfortable in a philosophical way, not this one isn't, but not in a kind of way that makes your skin crawl in this way. So hopefully you'll tune in for the next one. If this does not sound like your thing, maybe Mishima's text will be. Thank you, and see you soon.